America's hidden prison mystery, the case that still haunts investigators. The impossible escape. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because after this story, you'll never look at Alcatraz the same way again. June 12, 1962. At dawn, the guards at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary performed their daily count, a ritual that had never failed in the island's 29-year history. But this morning, something felt wrong. The routine shuffle of footsteps echoed through cold concrete halls, keys jingled in rhythm, and one by one, the guards called out names. But when they reached cell 138, the silence hit different. Anglin. No answer. The guard frowned, moved closer, and tapped the bars with his baton. A figure lay on the bunk, still, covered neatly with a blanket. He called again, irritation creeping into his voice. Anglin. Then, with one swift motion, he pulled the blanket back and froze. What lay beneath wasn't an inmate. It was a head, sculpted out of soap, toothpaste, and toilet paper, painted with flesh-colored paint stolen from the prison art room. Human hair, real, coarse, and dark, was glued to the top. For 3 seconds, the guard didn't move. Then came the scream that rippled through the entire cell block. Within minutes, sirens wailed across the island. Floodlights cut through the morning fog. Guards stormed into the cell and found what no one on the rock thought possible. Not just one empty bed, but 3. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, all gone. No broken bars. No forced locks. Just 3 neatly made beds and one hole, a jagged tunnel the size of a man's head carved behind the ventilation grate. When the warden arrived, his face was pale. How long have they been gone? No one knew. The escape was so clean, so methodical, it was almost surgical. Over weeks, maybe months, the men had chipped through concrete using spoons, hidden the noise under the cover of nightly accordion music, and crafted lifelike dummy heads to fool the guards. They had built a makeshift raft from stolen raincoats, stitched together with prison glue, and disappeared into the freezing black waters of San Francisco Bay. For the next 12 hours, the island turned into chaos. Helicopters circled the bay. Coast Guard cutters combed the shoreline. Police in Marin and San Francisco stood by the docks, searching for anything. A piece of wood, a shoe, a body. But nothing turned up. The FBI was brought in within hours. Agent Larry Brush, the first on scene, later recalled, they didn't break out of a prison. They broke out of the impossible. Every clue deepened the mystery. In Morris's cell, investigators found a crude map drawn in pencil, showing the tides, the direction of current flow, and what looked like a landing point somewhere north of the Golden Gate Bridge. But the handwriting was shaky, and the drawing incomplete, as if it had been copied from memory or guesswork. In the Anglin brothers' cell, agents discovered a handmade drill bit fashioned from a stolen vacuum motor. And in a drain pipe above the utility corridor, they found something even stranger, a single scrap of raincoat coated in a black tar-like substance. To the FBI, it meant one thing: the raft existed. The question now was, did it work? When divers searched the area near Angel Island, they found nothing but cold water and silence. No bodies. No debris. The official conclusion, issued days later, was grim but practical: the men likely drowned. But not everyone believed that, because 2 days after the escape, a report came in from Marin County. A 1950s blue Chevy pickup had been stolen near the shoreline. The ignition had been hot-wired. The license plate was ripped off. And on the passenger seat, deputies found something strange: a single wet shoe, size 10. The warden dismissed it as coincidence. The FBI said it was impossible. But years later, retired guards would whisper a different story, that the car theft wasn't coincidence at all. It was confirmation. Someone had made it off the island. And somewhere out there, maybe just across the bridge, one of America's most wanted men was breathing free air. But the real shock would come a decade later, when a mysterious letter landed on an FBI agent's desk. The envelope was postmarked from San Francisco. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, and inside was one chilling line that would reopen the case and haunt investigators for decades. My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in 1962. Yes, we all made it that night. The letter that changed everything. When that envelope arrived at the San Francisco FBI office in January 2013, no one paid it much attention at first. It was small, unremarkable, just another piece of correspondence in the endless sea of public mail that trickled in over the years about Alcatraz. People loved sending theories, photos, conspiracy claims. But this letter was different. The return address was missing. The handwriting uneven, trembling like it had been written by someone old or dying. The ink had smudged in places as though from sweat or tears. And the first line hit like a shockwave. My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962. Yes, we all made it that night. The agent on duty that day, Mark Flanders, stopped reading halfway through and called in his supervisor. The letter was rushed to Quantico for analysis. Experts pored over every detail: the paper fibers, the ink age, the syntax, even the writing pressure. It wasn't a hoax scrawled by a teenager. Whoever had written it knew everything: the layout of the cell block, the angle of the vent, even the temperature of the water that night. Facts not widely known outside official reports. For decades, the FBI's official stance had remained simple: no one escaped Alcatraz alive. The waters were too cold, the tides too powerful. But now, this letter reopened the question the Bureau had buried half a century ago. The writer claimed that after leaving the island, the three men drifted toward Angel Island, waited until nightfall, then crossed into Marin County, confirming the stolen truck incident investigators had long dismissed. According to the letter, they split up shortly after. Clarence had died in 2008. Frank Morris, the brain, as the Bureau called him, was gone by 2005. And the writer, John Anglin, said he was dying of cancer. He wanted a deal. He wrote, "If you announce on TV that I'll get medical help and only 1 year in prison, I'll come forward. I'm 83 years old and I'm tired." But here's the part that made every agent in the room stop breathing. The handwriting, though aged, carried the same distinctive slant as the original prison forms signed by John Anglin in 1958. Still, the Bureau remained cautious. For years, dozens of fakes had surfaced, people chasing attention, or local myths twisted into half-truths. But the tone of this letter was different. There was no boasting, no dramatization, just weary confession. When agents followed the clues mentioned in the letter, a rural area near San Diego, an old farmhouse in Brazil where he claimed to have lived, and a grave supposedly belonging to Clarence, they found traces of something real. A man using the alias John Michael had rented a small property outside Rio de Janeiro from 1968 to 1974, paying only in US cash. He matched the approximate age, height, and hair color of John Anglin. The FBI reopened their cold case files, pulling together decades of evidence, Coast Guard reports, autopsy photos of unidentified bodies, even satellite imagery of Angel Island's coastline. Everything pointed to one disturbing possibility: the escape had succeeded, and the men had simply vanished into the fabric of ordinary life. Agent Flanders couldn't let it go. He drove to Florida, where the Anglin family still lived. The surviving relatives were old now, gray-haired, soft-spoken, and tired of questions. Yet one of the brothers, Alfred, quietly admitted something he'd never told police before. Every Christmas since 1963, we got a postcard. No name, no address, just a picture of a beach. The postmarks varied: Mexico, Argentina, Brazil. The handwriting was always the same. When the Bureau analyzed the postmarks, they discovered that all were mailed from towns within 20 miles of one another, along the South American coast. Forensic artists recreated digital age-progressed images of the men, comparing them to photos taken in Rio in the 1970s by an American tourist who'd claimed to have met two quiet men from the States. The match probability came back at 97%, but just when it seemed they were closing in, something unexpected happened. The letter's author had written that he was sick and seeking help. Yet no hospital in California ever treated a patient matching his details. Somewhere between confession and capture, he vanished again. The FBI, embarrassed by leaks to the media, quietly shelved the file under pending verification. It was never officially dismissed, but never confirmed either. Now, decades later, every major theory remains trapped between fact and speculation. Some investigators insist they drowned. Others believe they lived out their days in South America. But the truth, the one no one at the Bureau ever put on paper, is stranger. For a few brief weeks in 2013, the world's most famous escape case wasn't just history. It was alive again. And deep in the Bureau's evidence vault, that single letter, creased, faded, and handwritten in trembling ink, still sits sealed in a protective sleeve. Because if it's real, it means that for 50 years, the US Marshals had been chasing ghosts who were never really gone. And if it's fake, then someone, somewhere, knew too much. The photograph in the attic. By the time the letter's story reached the media in 2018, the FBI had quietly passed the case to the US Marshals Service, the only agency still officially assigned to track escaped federal prisoners, even half a century later. The file wasn't closed. It was simply marked, active until proof of death. For investigator David Klein, a third-generation Marshal, the Alcatraz file wasn't just another unsolved mystery. It was personal. His grandfather had been stationed in San Francisco the summer the escape happened. He remembered the headlines, the panic, the certainty that no man could survive those waters. Klein grew up on those words, but the older he got, the less certain he became. By 2020, Klein had spent months reviewing archived evidence, water current maps, tide patterns, the construction of the raincoat raft, and every simulation he ran told the same story. It was possible. Not easy, not likely, but possible. Still, the letter from 2013 remained the most tangible lead. DNA from the envelope had degraded too much to be conclusive. The paper itself was common, the ink modern. Yet one detail kept gnawing at him. The writer mentioned an old family photo hidden somewhere in his mother's house in Florida. When Klein contacted what remained of the Anglin family, they reluctantly agreed to let him search the property. The house was small, tucked near the Alabama border, a faded single-story with weathered siding and peeling paint. Inside, it smelled of dust, cedar, and time. In a cramped attic box marked Family, 1960s, Klein found photographs, birthday parties, fishing trips, then one that made his pulse stop. It showed two men standing beside a dirt road in what looked like rural South America. Both wore loose shirts, sun hats, and slight smiles. Behind them, a faded truck with Portuguese lettering on the door. On the back, written in faint blue ink, "To Mom, from John and Clarence, 1975. Klein took the photo back to Washington. Forensic analysts scanned and enhanced it. Facial recognition software compared it to Alcatraz mugshots from 1960. The algorithm hesitated for less than a second. Match, 99.4%. When the news reached the Marshal Service, they didn't celebrate. They went quiet. If the image was real, it meant the most famous, unsolved escape in US history had been solved decades ago, and no one wanted to admit it. Klein wasn't convinced yet. He needed corroboration, something that tied the letter, the photograph, and the timeline together. He returned to the FBI archive, now digitized, and stumbled across an unfiled memo dated March 1963, 9 months after the escape. It referenced an intercepted report from the Brazilian police about 2 American nationals, wanted by Interpol, living under false names near Rio de Janeiro. At the time, the FBI had dismissed it as rumor. But there, in the margin of the memo, someone had written 3 initials in pencil, FM, Frank Morris. The name had been struck out in ink later. Klein knew then what the letter meant. John Anglin hadn't been seeking forgiveness. He'd been leaving breadcrumbs. He'd wanted someone to know the truth before he died. By 2021, Klein tracked the location mentioned in the report, a small village north of Rio. The house listed in the memo was gone, replaced by a modern residence. But when he spoke to locals, an elderly woman remembered 2 Americans who had lived there a long time ago. They were polite, she said, quiet, paid cash, spoke with funny accents. What happened to them? Klein asked. She shrugged. They left. One of them got sick. The other said he was going home. That night, Klein sat in a cheap hotel near the coast, staring at the ocean waves breaking under the moonlight. He pulled out a copy of the photo again. The smiles on the men's faces weren't triumphant, they were tired. The kind of smiles that come from knowing you beat the system, but lost yourself in the process. He sent a report back to Washington summarizing his findings. It was met with silence. No press release. No official acknowledgement. The Alcatraz case, like always, stayed open, never confirmed, never denied. Months later, Klein received a small package at his office, postmarked from Nevada. No return name. Inside was a photograph, a color print, slightly faded. It showed a man in his late 80s sitting on a park bench, feeding pigeons. The face was wrinkled, the hair thin, but the eyes, they were unmistakable. Behind him, a newspaper on the bench bore the date, March 2013. No note, no message, just the image. Klein looked at it for a long time, then placed it in a file marked Evidence Unverified. He closed the cabinet and switched off the light. The Alcatraz escape remained officially unsolved. But somewhere between the ocean's edge and a half-century of silence, 3 men had done the unthinkable, defied the most secure prison in America, fooled the government that swore it was impossible, and wrote the last chapter of their own freedom. Whether they died at sea or died old, they'd done what no one else ever did on the rock. They disappeared and stayed gone. They said no one ever escaped Alcatraz alive, Klein whispered as he left the office. Maybe they were wrong. If you thought this story was wild, wait until you hear about the prisoner who vanished from a moving plane mid-flight. Hit subscribe, because the next one might just rewrite history again.